There's a chat.
And there's a chat.
Oh, it's Scott.
Okay.
Okay. Well, you're muted now anyway, Scott, so your audio doesn't matter. Can you hear us? Can you nod? No, I think he's frozen.
Oh,
No, there he
there's-
is.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know how to get rid of that now.
View.
This here, I think I get rid of.
Can
There.
we hear Scott?
He's
Can't
muted.
hear anybody right now.
Yeah, we muted him. Okay, so when he was praying for patience, I think that's for me, because as we studied Ecclesiastes this week, he was getting frustrated with me because I keep asking the same questions, even right before we started. So that
Up until half an hour ago, we've wrestled about this for 2 weeks. So
So if you guys wrestle with it, it's okay. And as Scott said, he first looked at Ecclesiastes and started studying it when he was, I don't know, 10 or 12. I said, Scott, I am like decades behind you. Give me some patience. So anyhow, the book of Ecclesiastes, excuse me, is in the Old Testament, and it's 21 chapters. And it is not a book of the Bible that if you're a churchgoer, they don't often do sermons or Bible studies really on the book of Ecclesiastes, although chapter 3 is, you will know those verses, you will have heard them mainly at funerals. There's a time, give the first line, there's a time.
a time to be born and a time to die is in there, and they love that at funerals. So
You'll have heard that. But as far as someone studying all 21 chapters of Ecclesiastes, it's not often done. In fact, I listened to a minister do a conference of ministers challenging them to teach on the book of Ecclesiastes. So, and why is it often studied? Many people say it's depressing, but we challenge you not to look at it as depressing, but challenge you to look at it as a wake-up call. Is that fair? The book was named when the Old Testament was translated. Remember, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. And in the year of between 285 and 247 BC, it was translated from Hebrew to Greek by 70 Jewish scholars. And so that translation was called the Septuagint. And do you want to talk about the title?
oh, well, in the New Testament, when we see the word church, it is usually the Greek word ecclesia, which just means a gathering place, and ecclesia is a gathering place. And so when they translated from Hebrew to Greek, why they named it Ecclesiastes, it is a gathering of words. It is a gathering of wisdom. And so they named it that, and it's a Greek word. It's not the original Hebrew, but it's close enough.
Okay, the book of Ecclesiastes is part of the wisdom books in the Bible, and there's 4 wisdom books in the Bible: the books of Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Job, and the Song of Songs. What's interesting is Psalms, we know we studied those, and David wrote a lot of them, but Solomon wrote 18 of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. He wrote Proverbs. We don't know who wrote Job, and he wrote the Song of Songs. So many of the books of wisdom were in part or totally written by Solomon. And we're going to talk about who Solomon was in a second. So these are called the books of wisdom. Some people call Ecclesiastes the book of foolishness. So, and it's the same man who wrote it. When these were written, we don't exactly know. It is generally believed that he wrote Psalms and he wrote Proverbs and the Song of Psalms earlier in his life. And he actually wrote Ecclesiastes later, or one of the last things in his life, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Who was Solomon? Okay, Solomon lived between 990 BC and 931 BC. He lived 59 years. He lived 3,000 years ago, you guys. I want you to put that in perspective as we study this book, that this, what he was struggling with is something we struggle with 3,000 years later. You want to talk about, he was a king, he was the son of King David. And do you want to talk about just the Israelites and the whole king thing?
Yeah, a couple of things. He was arguably the wealthiest person who's ever lived. And you know, being the person I am, it talks in Kings about how much gold, how much tribute, how much, what got given to him each year. And you try and, you know, do the best you can, Kay's waiting, try and do the best you can to bring that up. And he was wealthy beyond compare. He was certainly the wealthiest person of his time. When it was time for him to take over as king, he asks, God instructs him, you know, I will grant you what you ask. And he asks for wisdom to rule. And wisdom and knowledge, we're not going to get into that, but he was also knowledgeable. And there's a story in, I think that's also in Kings, that this Queen of Sheba, or Queen Sheba, we're not sure, but this Queen of Sheba comes and she says, I've heard about your wisdom. I've heard how marvelous you were, but I didn't believe it until I saw it for myself. And she comes bringing in so much gold, you know, you could sink a ship with it. And all we know is she's from somewhere, probably in North Africa, but she also brings more spice.
Yes.
She's from Ethiopia.
Well, yeah.
And she came up through Arabia, and the steps of the camel train that she came from was where I lived.
Really, the camel, okay. And that is, they say she brought in more spices than had ever been seen in one place, you know, in the what we call the Holy Land.
She went to Yemen and picked up all those.
And Yemen, that's amazing. Sometimes, okay, and I realize I'm going to be down a rabbit hole here pretty soon, but she did go through Yemen, and there is a trail out across the desert that the Nabateans only knew. But yeah, that's right. And so he is wealthy beyond compare. There is no one like him, and he has 40 years or so of peace, which is sort of a rare thing in that vicinity. But it takes money to wage war, and no one can go up against him. There's no chance. He can hire mercenaries, he can do anything he wants to do. And so instead of going to war with him, they sort of suck up to him. They send him gifts, they pay him tribute. And so he has peace in his time. The one thing I want you to keep in mind, I told you Mary and I have wrestled for 2 weeks over this. And she says, but what do we do with this? And when we'd sit in church, and ministers like to do things like their theme is 3 words that all begin with the same letter. And Mary would sit and actually guess what the next word was going to be, because if the first one is strength, the second one is going to be, you know, whatever that begins with S. And that's what we like to sort of package this stuff. I want you to remember, because if you look at this, as Mary said, it can be depressing. And you know, the question may come up, well, what do we do with this in our lives? Remember, as we go through this, and I don't know what we'll do about people not here to hear this, but Israel begged for a king for generations. They asked for a king. They demanded a king. All the cool countries have kings, and we'll be powerful, and you know, on and on. And God sent word to them through the prophets, you don't want a king. You really don't. It's not how I intended you to live. You know, you have a high priest, and we're going to live a different way. And they said, no. Like I said, all the cool countries have kings. We want a king. And he said, it's not going to work out well for you. So they got their kings. Remember this, the kings did not work out well for them. Solomon's son, 1 generation later, is a bonehead, and he's willful, and he splits the kingdom in 2. He makes everybody so mad that they completely split into basically two countries. Solomon is the apex of kings. Solomon is exactly what God sent the prophets to warn them against. This is what happens when you have a king. You don't need a king. Keep that in mind. Because if people take this and they say, well, we don't want to say that a mighty man of God lost his way. It's sort of like the book of Ruth. When Ruth goes to Boaz on the threshing floor, there are people that tell that they talk about this garment she's wearing, and they say, well, that was a wedding dress. Because they don't want to admit that this woman offered herself to Boaz as a wife, but not exactly in the traditional fashion. So they say she was wearing a wedding dress because they don't like the implications of what was going on. People don't like hearing this, supposedly this mighty man of God talking the way he talks. You're not going to like some of this. The man loses his way, and it comes from the amount of money and power that he has. So this, if you're going to look for what do we do with this, you need to learn this is what we don't want. This is what and I think that most people will see something of themselves in the things that the place that Solomon gets to. Maybe not everything, but each of us should probably see ourselves in parts of it. So this is sort of a negative example, and it's okay that it's in the Bible. It is there as a book of wisdom, as a book of learning. They are not all sermons, and they are not all instructions. We have just sort of tried to turn it into that. So hopefully that's enough.
So, yeah.
Given the title,
Yes.
Ecclesiastes, who is he writing to?
Well, that's a good question. Who is he writing to? That will come up for a lot of people before we're done. And this is him venting. As much as anything, it is him griping and venting because he sees this world as a broken place. And it is him teaching his people. But I think at some level, he's trying to just let everybody know how miserable he is. In some ways, it's typical of us. I mean, people love to vent. Who's he writing to? He calls himself the teacher. And the word that's teacher in Hebrew is one who gathers. And people say, well, he's gathering people like to a synagogue. There's no synagogue. They're going to get what he's gathering is words. It is a gatherer of words, and that's how
he was a prolific writer.
Yes, he was, and that's what a teacher is a gatherer of words. So he's writing to anybody who will listen. But in some ways, I think he's writing to himself, Gene. I really do, and you'll see. We'll go over some of that as we go through this.
So a couple of things. I told you he lived 59 years. He became king when he was 20 and basically died when he was 60. So he from 20 to 60, he was king for 40 years. And as Scott said, this was the only time in the history of Israel that there was this 40 years of peace.
Yeah.
To this day, there's not been 40 years of peace for the people of Israel. So he had a very unusual time.
We should probably mention one other thing. There are people who will insist Solomon didn't really write this. This is somebody else. I may be more intimately familiar with this book than any other in the Bible. I have spent, 50 years with it because some of the—
He's strange. No.
Well, no, but some of the things that he says, what Solomon does is he observes things and his observations are correct. His conclusions may not be, and you'll see that as well. But I've gone down this Virginia can't get in. I don't know what to do. You want to click up there and see if she needs to get in? You want to hand me the mouse?
She's not in there, I don't think.
No. She's not, it's not asking for her to get in, so I don't know. Sorry, Kay. But anyway, so I've gone down the same rabbit holes. You look around and you see injustice, you see brokenness, and I tend to get frustrated with people. That's my nature. And I read this and it spoke to me. And it would be years before I could see the other side. But I've spent a lot of years. I will tell you, I am utterly convinced. Some people say it's Solomon. Some people say it's not. I believe it's Solomon. And as we go through, I'll show you some examples of why I think that.
Do you want me to touch base on since you talked about kings, you don't want me to read those? It's okay.
No, you can go ahead. This
Okay,
is
so-
from the book, what, First Kings?
Yeah, First Kings. So the three things that we learned, that is, he was wise, and that you can find proof of that in First Kings 4, 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom, exceedingly deep insight and understanding beyond measure, like the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than that of all the men of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. Solomon composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop growing in the wall. And he taught about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. So men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So he was wise.
Let's go with that. We'll tell you the things we tell you about him, because I don't want to spend the whole class on that, but they're in there. They tell us about the wealth. And if you
How
start.
about the women? Should I at least say that? He had a
Yeah,
lot
no,
of,
let's talk about the women.
he had a lot. Yes, go ahead.
In that thing that you just quoted, and I'm cheating here because I haven't read it, is that with a little w or with a big W? Wisdom.
Little,
Okay, little w.
Yeah.
Okay,
earthly wisdom, yes.
okay.
And if you wonder at any point, how does this make sense? That someone who's been granted more wisdom than anybody before then does things that are foolish, we'll talk about it. If you find yourself thinking, well, that's kind of inconsistent, it's really not, and you'll definitely get it.
So he had a lot of stuff, number two, and a lot of stuff. One of the lot of stuffs he had is he had a lot of women. First Kings 11, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of the Pharaoh, women of Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sinai, as well as Hittite women. These women were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, for surely they will turn your hearts after their gods. Yet Solomon clung to these women in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away.
And we see that documented, literally 700 wives of noble birth, some say princesses, but noble birth, and 300 concubines, 1,000. That's not wise.
That's why he died early.
And they did, in fact, turn his heart away from Yahweh. And it was part of the ruin of Solomon that he insisted, but it's also part of the decadence of having the wealth and the power that comes with being this sort of apex king. That's part of it. That, I think, I'm glad you said that, because you need to keep that in mind as we
I
read.
have one more tidbit I have to offer
Okay.
about Sheba.
Yeah.
So she went home after she visited Solomon with the son. And that's why the people in Ethiopia have very fine black features. And it's why Ethiopia is very Christian.
Wow. Yeah, well, the idea of Ethiopia and the Coptics being sort of a stronghold of this worship of Yahweh, what, Christianity is technically is later, but if we see it all as one thing, I think there's little doubt that Sheba is part of it. And later we see Philip meeting that Ethiopian man who's reading the scriptures, and Philip is sent to explain it to him. Ethiopia is a center of the Coptics, they have a Bible that is in some places maybe more accurate than ours, really good stuff. So is Sheba a part of that? Probably. Yeah, part of a plan that goes, so far back.
And
I agree.
the women.
And the women. Yeah, anyway.
And the third thing, so he was wise, he had a lot of stuff, and he accomplished a lot. And, he built, remember, David wasn't allowed to build the temple. He got the stuff ready for his son to build the temple. He built the temple, but he went on after building the temple and he built the palace, his palace.
So the temple that's in Jerusalem now, David wanted to build a temple to Yahweh, and he was a bloody-handed man. And God instructs him, you don't get to do this. That's not who's going to build my temple, but your son will. And so David says, well, if I can't build it, he devoted tremendous resources, money, to bringing in all the raw materials. He brings in stone. He brings in cedar from Lebanon. He brings in woodworkers and just has them on standby
So when he dies.
for the time when Solomon takes over. But one of the things that we see from the history of this is Solomon spends 3.5 years, roughly, give or take, building this magnificent temple, but he spends 7 years building his own house. He dedicates roughly twice as much time to building his own palace. There's another clue to what goes wrong with Solomon.
And one more thing we're going to do before we start, and those are two phrases that appear in the book of Solomon a lot before we start. One of them is under the sun, and it appears 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes.
For all the work that a man does under the sun, he says, and under the sun has to do, it is this place that we inhabit. It is this material world. And we have, as his father David said, we have 70 years, 80 if we're lucky, and then we evaporate like the mist. We're gone. And this life under the sun, he's talking about in this place, in the years that are given to us, and it becomes, and I'm skipping ahead, but it becomes wearisome to him. And so he talks about this life of humans under the sun quite often. 29 times Mary has apparently counted.
And the other phrase is, and it shows up differently in many different translations, and it's the Hebrew word is hevel,
Havel.
and it's in the Berean Bible, it shows up as futility of futilities. Oftentimes it showed up as vanity of vanities. Explain that one.
That word havel, its origins are mist, smoke. It's something that is transient. It's something that doesn't last. Like with mist, you can reach out and try and grab it and it's gone. And it has to do with things that are insubstantial, transient, meaningless. And then that also becomes a theme for him. But in the old King James, it said vanity of vanities, as we're about to read, useless stuff. And it's all just pursuing the wind, pursuing so it is either breath or mist. And he sees in this world all these things that are so insubstantial and that you reach out and try and grab them and they're gone. And that is a repeating theme in this book.
And when we read it in Berean, it's going to be futility of futilities. And that appears 38 times.
And so we debated whether we would get all the way through chapter 2. I'll feel good if we just read something from the actual Bible.
May I go?
Yes.
Ask you, what for this man, Solomon? What were the current beliefs about after death?
That's also a good question. Jean says, what were at the time the current beliefs in after death? And I presume you mean just in the Jews, what we call Israel, because they were all over the place. They were all over the place. And I'll actually skip ahead. In the New Testament, when Jesus was alive, we hear about the Sadducees. The Sadducees believed there was no afterlife. You think, but they were leaders of the Jews. That's right. They were leaders of the Jews. And they said, get what you can while you're here, because there's nothing after that. They had been taught, there's a term that we read, Abraham's bosom. We see that in the old, to be held tight to God. There was a teaching that we, can be with God after there's a life eternal. This certainly was a belief there among a lot of them, but people lose their way. People begin to say, you know what? I don't want to worry about what I get after I die. I want mine now. And so people believe what is convenient, today. They did then. So there were people who believed that there was no afterlife, and there were people who were confident that they were held fast. So it's all over the place.
I'm going to read the first 11 verses, which was considered a poem. These are the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Futility of futilities, says the teacher, futility of futilities. Everything is futile. What does a man gain from all his labor, at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets. It hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows southward, then turns northward, round and round it swirls, ever returning on its course. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which the streams come, there again they flow. All things are wearisome, more than one can describe. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear content with hearing. What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a case where you can say, look, this is new? It has already existed in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of those who came before, and those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow after.
So that's not depressing or anything. In this opening, Solomon gives us a lot of clues about who he is and where he is and what's going on with him. Obviously, starting out vanity of vanities or futility of futilities. Everything is futile. There's just nothing worthwhile in the whole earth. That's got to be a clue. And what I had to actually last night talk to Mary about, because it's just hard to believe that this mighty man of God is sort of depressed. But I want you to imagine that someone you know says, the world is more wearisome than I can describe. What would you think about that person? You would think, well, this person is depressed. This person is in a dark place. If you would think that about someone on the street, think it about Solomon. He's saying the same thing. The world is more wearisome than I can describe. This place is a burden to me. And he tells us that right up front. Futility of futilities. And I would hope that most of you understand you've known someone who's reached this point. When he says the eye is not content with seeing, nor the ear content with hearing. He's seen everything, he's heard everything, and it's not enough. So I'm going to try and give you a couple of examples of things that maybe, make this make sense. As far as the eye not being content with seeing, we knew someone in San Antonio that lives at a place called Crown Ridge. There's a cliff and it overlooks Fiesta, Texas, and they see fireworks, every night. And it gets to the point that it's not exciting anymore. They're jaded. It's like, I see it every night. It's no big deal. No more fireworks. The ooh and ah that we feel, they don't feel anymore. And that's how humans tend to get if you don't watch it a little bit. But as far as what satisfies, Solomon is obviously dissatisfied with everything. And I remember a guy that I knew right after we got out of school. He got into a business. You can say right place at the right time. Maybe he was just that good. But he starts making money and he goes and buys a new Mercedes, because in his mind, if he owns a new Mercedes, he's important. Everyone's good, because he was a geek. Is that fair to say? I mean, he was not real popular in school, and he thinks, well, this, is going to make people ooh and ah, and he gets it, and he's not satisfied. He's like, this is not how I imagined this was going to feel. So he goes and buys the next model up. He literally, a few months later, trades in his new Mercedes and gets the next model up. And he did it another time. He got the top of the line one, and it never satisfied. He never felt like he thought he was going to feel. The eye is not content with seeing, the ear is not content with hearing. This man is discontent, and he's telling us about himself. Sure, there's a lesson in there for us, and the question will be, well, how do we not get that way? But first, let's look at who Solomon is, where he is, and the disaffected attitude that he has. Everything is wearisome.
How about the verse? There's no remembrance of those who came before, and those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow after.
There is no remembrance of those who came before. You don't have to speculate too much to know Solomon doesn't really care about them. What's eating Solomon is he has realized that he's not going to live forever. I remember asking my dad, where were you? How old were you when you first had to come to grips with your own mortality? Solomon is seeing, I'm not going to live forever. He's actually remembered, but we don't know that much about him. So here, let me give you one more example. Do you know the writer Larry McMurtry? Lonesome Dove, famous guy. Larry McMurtry wrote a book called Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen. And Walter Benjamin was a literary critic. I get one head shake, one person who knows it. And there's a place in the early going of this book. Murtry is a prolific reader, McMurtry, and he's gone to a library and he's talking about Walter Benjamin, who's a literary critic. But he's realized that in libraries, there are all these books that were earth-shattering. They were the most famous books in the world. Literally, the world paid attention to them. And they were earth-shattering for a while. And now they're relegated to some back shelf and they're dusty and nobody knows the book and certainly nobody knows the author. They were so important and now they're not important at all. And he's reached an age where he's kind of realizing, most of my stuff is going to go the same way. People will not remember me forever. And all the acclaim that I get, people will forget about me. And this is one of the things that eats humans up, is this idea that I'm going to pass away, pass out of this, and nobody will remember my name.
One of the things that bugged me while we were studying this early on is this pastor that we really like to listen to. He kept saying that this book is for your non-believer friends, because if you believe, you don't struggle with this. And I'm thinking, well, I struggle with this. So and I think about my father later in life, and we were sitting there talking to him and he said to me one day, he says, you know what? I can't imagine the earth without me on it. And my dad was a believer. So I told Scott, I like Pastor Paul a lot, but I don't like his take on this book, because I think this is something, we all struggle with.
Sure.
And by the way, I do think it's sort of odd. He probably asked his dad when he was like 10 years old, when is the first time? Anyhow,
there is so this is sort of an introduction to Solomon and where he is when he begins to write. Yes, Gene.
3,000 years ago, or whatever.
Yeah.
Is there a tie from the Old Testament out to the Messiah that's coming in the New Testament? And this is saying, look, every card I play goes nowhere. Is there a search for what's coming, the Messiah?
Oh, okay. Is there a tie out to the Messiah? Many places through the Old Testament, they are everywhere. Again, I'll have to skip ahead a little bit, but what we see is Solomon has gone searching through his own data bank, his own wisdom, rather than searching for God. It is conspicuously empty of that, void of that in this book. It's true. While there are prophecies and we see a part of a path. Now, is that to say that Jesus, the Messiah, comes to give us some relief, to give us an idea? Yes, but is Solomon, does he specifically reference it? Not so much, and that's part of the problem.
But I like his approach. It's just I want to experience all of these things, and I have experienced it, and it's futile.
You won't like it by the time I'm done with it. She said, I like his approach, and I just had to be honest. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But there is one other thing. He says, there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. And people love to argue, oh, well, there are airplanes. He's not talking about airplanes. He's talking about people. I tell Mary periodically, we'll talk about something. It's a different flavor of the same ice cream. All right. It's not, it may not be identical. You know, you want to throw some lettuce and make some, it's still ice cream. And people and their behaviors, the injustices, the self-centeredness, that's the sort of thing. And as far as building, you know, okay, so he builds this magnificent temple, but let's face it, there are other grand buildings in the world. And he's saying it's not so monumental as we want to believe. He is weary of the world. And when he says there's nothing new under the sun, what does that tell you about him? Well, he says, I want to do something new. I want to do something important and you know, do something new under the sun, and it's not working for me. The top of the line Mercedes is not satisfying me. And I wanted to be more than that. This is where he is. And we fall into this similar trap because there's nothing new under the sun. At some point in our lives, I think we all sort of go down this path a little bit.
Verse 12, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid upon the sons of men to occupy them. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun and have found them all to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have grown and increased in wisdom beyond all those before me who are over Jerusalem, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. So I set my mind to know wisdom and madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and as knowledge grows, grief increases.
Once again, you see where he is. I've seen it all. I have seen everything there is under the sun, and I'm going to tell you, it's all futile. It's all meaningless. It's vapor. It comes, it goes. He does say that people come and go. The only thing that endures are the sun and the stars and the earth. And so he says, I saw it all, and I'm here to tell you it's meaningless. So you ask, who is he writing this? I would say pity whoever he's writing this to, because he is, he's laying it on pretty thick. And he says, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I told you, a while back, I made the mistake of making videos about politics, and I realized it's about trying to do something. I'm going to change this place, the injustices and all. No, I'm not. It's not up to me. But what is lacking can't even, if it's not there, you can't count it. It's all useless. And he says, so I said to myself, I've grown and increased in wisdom beyond all those before me who were in Jerusalem. Some of you, he's pretty impressed with himself, and he may be right, but he's using it as a justification for where he goes. It's his conclusions. There's a song, a lot of you will remember by a band called Kansas, Dust in the Wind. Actually, this was Wayward Son there too, but there's a place in there where he says, and if I claim to be a wise man, it surely means that I don't know. Well, here we go. This is Solomon. This is a wise guy, but he says, I know it all. I've seen it all, and I'm wise enough to understand perfectly everything that's out there. That wasn't the gift that was given to him. So let's get down to verse 17. This is where we begin to get to the crux of the matter. So I set my mind to know wisdom and madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. Now, what he says is, being wise, and he'll say it directly here shortly. I don't gain much from that. So I might as well be like all of you silly people. And I'm going to pursue, maybe I can find wisdom in folly. That is not an experiment. That's an excuse. That's a dodge. He's finally said, to heck with it. I'm just going to go do all this other stuff. And you will see that singularly, displayed. But this is his beginning of making excuses. I'm so wise, I figure I might as well pursue folly for a while too. That's where he's at. And we see people make those excuses.
And there's a lot of people, if you if you Google, a lot of the sermons act like Solomon did an experiment. He went out and did an experiment. And when you think about that, this just really doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's really an excuse.
I'm gonna pursue wisdom by pursuing folly. No. Now there's one point here. He says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and as knowledge grows, grief increases. And again, he's talking about people. People let him down. So I was a strange child, and my mother would affirm that. But I remember I'm about 3.
Now remember this, he was about 3.
I could have, maybe just about 4 getting there, but I know where we were living. And my dad takes me to the barber shop, right? And it's Saturday morning, and he's taking the little man, and we're getting our hair cut and stuff. And there's a shoe shine man. Remember how they used to always have shoe shine men? And they were almost always black. And they, if they were in the right place, they could make a living, but it was a strange time. And my dad knows the guy because he's in there every week. And he goes up to this guy after the haircuts to introduce me. And he's taught me to shake hands and, little man, do all the stuff. And I start reaching my hand out. And I almost hate to say this, but my dad says from behind me, be careful, that black will rub off on you. Yeah, no. And my dad is wasn't a virulent racist. People do stupid things. And at the time, he thought it was funny. It wasn't, but he did. Being a child, I, intellectually may have known that that's not a real problem, but I drew my hand back.
It was straight.
I'm 3 years old, and he's told me this, and it's in that voice, and I jumped. Immediately, I could see the hurt in that man's eyes. And I knew that this is not a joke. And suddenly I know something about my dad that I probably would wish I didn't know. Now, again, I was unusual for that age, but I could see in this man's face, and he was big enough to treat it like it was a joke, to laugh it off. But I could see differently. I had no doubt about the hurt. And you can imagine having this child pull his hand back, and I wasn't afraid of touching the man. Again, I just reacted, but I knew all that in an instant. And when Solomon says, as knowledge increases, so does grief. Sometimes we know more about people than we would like to. I reached a point back here in my, early college days, maybe, where I was sort of in the same place as him. And I used to say, I've met all the people I need to know, because you see these things. Well, we all have it. It's easy for me to see it in you, not so easy for me to see it in me. Introduction to Solomon. As wisdom increases, so does sorrow, and as knowledge increases, so does grief. He's seen things in people that have made him sad, depressed. This is who we're listening to.
Chapter 2. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy what is good. But it proved to be futile. I said of laughter, it's folly, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I sought to cheer my body with wine and to embrace folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, until I could see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I expanded my pursuits. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself where I planted all kinds of fruit trees. I built reservoirs to water my groves of flourishing trees. I acquired men servants and maid servants, and servants were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me, and I accumulated for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and providences. I gathered to myself male and female singers and the delights of sons of men, many concubines.
Yeah, that'll get to be too much if we go further.
Okay.
So I said to myself, self, I will test you with pleasure. This is what we know as hedonism, where let's just see how much pleasure I can rack up. But he says I'm gonna test myself with pleasure. It's an experiment. See, when these other people are doing these things, they're doing wrong in the sight of God. When I do it, it's an experiment and it's okay. The band The Who, Pete Townsend, got in trouble for possessing child pornography. And he told them, I'm doing research. It's an excuse, it's a dodge. And he has decided to pursue this line of hedonism. And he says, you know, it's folly. What does it accomplish? Like laughter. What does it really benefit you? He's just thrashing about. But I sought to cheer my body with wine and to embrace folly. I want you to look at this is verse 3, right? I sought to cheer myself with wine and embrace folly. And then there's this little sort of parenthetical, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. So I was doing it to be wise. These other people are doing it just to be, you know, have a lot to drink. I am looking for wisdom there, and wisdom is still guiding my mind. The guy is just, you know, he's justifying things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with drinking wine. That is not the point. Let's look at Solomon. This guy has reached a point where he's self-medicating, you know, and he says so. And he says he did this until I could see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. You see a theme developing here with him, the few days of our life. And until I could see, I drank until I could see what was good for men to do. You can tell, you know, he doesn't come there. This man is self-deluded. He is telling himself things. I don't know about you. I won't speak for you. I have been known to do that at times. Yes, Gene.
This is, he's saying, excuse me, and I'm not sure I'm there yet, about under heaven, not under the sun.
Yeah. The idea of under the sun, God is in heaven and we're down here. That's still the thing. It's not exactly the same words, but it's the same thing. Now, curiously, you know where he says it's a pursuit of the wind, or it's a grasping, and that word can also mean breath, the word that he uses. But there are other places where, in fact, a lot of these, where he's using the word ruach, and ruach means spirit or wind or breath. It means all three. And there's a distinction there, and we'll get to that. But you're right, often the words, you know, have different context. I think in this case, the under heaven just means we're stuck down here in this depressing little place. God is in heaven, and it is the things that we do under heaven during the few days of our miserable lives.
Which is worthwhile.
Worthwhile, yeah. I'm fine. He says I was drank until so that I could determine what was really good to do. Just introduction to Solomon and what's going on here.
So I became.
Oh, wait a second. I'm sorry. That's why I don't like to go too many, because he says, I expanded my pursuits. I built houses. Solomon never built a house in his life, right?
I planted vineyards.
I planted
He's
vineyards.
not talking about being the carpenter. He's saying, hey, I authorize.
I know what he's talking about, but you'll see that he talks later
About the
very
toil.
specifically about his, you know, and as if he did these things. because the little people out there are just extensions of him. Listen to him and listen for that because it's here. But I built vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself where I planted all kinds of fruit trees. I built reservoirs to water my groves of flourishing trees.
3,000 years ago, too.
There's that parable that Jesus tells about the rich man who says, you know what? I've piled up so much stuff. I have so much grain. I need to build some new barns. I'm going to tear down the old barns and build some new ones because I am so fabulously wealthy. There's nothing new under the sun. That's a couple of 1,000 years later, 1,000 years later. But you listen to what has happened. This is why God sends word through the prophets. You don't really want a king. Solomon is the apex.
And one of
But
the,
that text about, I'm so rich, but I need another silo, it's a foolish thing. He doesn't know if he's gonna live tomorrow morning.
You fool, this night your soul will be required to, you're not guaranteed tomorrow. And in Jesus' parable was about that idea that pursuing this is folly. And Solomon at some level knows it's folly. He's just saying, I'm doing an experiment with it.
so when is enough enough?
Yeah.
Never. Okay, verse 9. So
Did you do 7?
I did.
Well, I'm sorry. This is
Okay.
why it's hard to go that many. Listen to this in 7. I acquired men servants and maid servants, and servants were born in my house. He is literally keeping people like pets. He's breeding them. He is saying, I'm looking for stuff and I acquired people. It's not enough that I built buildings, which I didn't realize I had other people build them, but I acquired people to be part of my, my possessions. This man is consumed with his own power and his own importance. This to me is I acquired more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I did all this great stuff. I accumulated to myself silver and gold. And there's a part in another book where we told he got to the point that he viewed silver as worthless. It's like, oh yeah, you want it? Fine. He's only interested in gold because he's got so much wealth that even silver he just doesn't pay attention to. I mean, we're told that. And I gathered to myself male and female singers and the delights of the sons of men, many concubines. Who's he talking to, Gene? You asked that earlier. Well, he's bragging to somebody. That's also one of those things that happen. I mean, he's making sure you understand how important he is. And I'm sorry, Mary, but we don't want to leave those behind. 9.
So I became great and surpassed all in Jerusalem who had preceded me, and my wisdom remained with me. What did you say? That sort of.
My wisdom remained with me the whole time. Trust me, I was being wise while I did all this.
So, but isn't that word wisdom a godlike attribute?
Well,
I don't know what wisdom this guy is talking about if we think he's saying all of this vanity.
what I think we should get from this is he is telling himself, you're right. I mean, he asked for wisdom and God says he granted it to him, but I don't think he's exercising that wisdom at this point. I don't think that wisdom stayed with him. And there's part of, we'll just get to it early, but there's part of the irony of him insisting I'm using God's wisdom while doing this stuff that is decidedly not what God had in mind for him.
Anything my eyes desired, I did not deny myself. I refused my heart no pleasure, for my heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor.
We got to stop there. That thing is so full. I mean, I became great, and there's his brag. I became greater than anybody who came before me. Anything my eyes desired, I did not deny myself. Oh, there's wisdom for you. That's hedonism. That is exactly what, and there, some people who pursue hedonism don't understand when you say, perhaps this is not the greatest thing for humans to pursue. It's like, okay, well, I'll take yours. I mean, if you don't want all of yours, I'll take it too. But I didn't deny myself. Anything I saw, I reached out and took it. And then he says, I refused my heart no pleasure, for my heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. There's what I'm talking about. He acts like he's actually done the work, and all of this stuff is what he deserves. There's a commercial that I think they still use that jingle. And Mary, again, she knows me. I hated that commercial because of what it says. You want a better life at the best price. You deserve it at cons. You deserve this stuff. We see commercials at Christmas for, Lexus and BMW. And what do they say? You deserve it. What about all those poor people who can't afford a Lexus or a BMW? It must be because they don't deserve it. You deserve it. And this is Solomon saying that all of this stuff that I acquired, everything I laid my eyes on, if I wanted it, I reached out and took it. And it was my reward for all my labor. I deserved it. Folly. And he has pursued it and he has found it.
Yet when I considered all the work that my hands had accomplished and what I had toiled to achieve, I found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun.
That pursuit of wind is ruach. That's the one that is spirit. There's a reason why one word describes spirit, wind, and breath. It is this acknowledgement that God infuses us, those things, that life that we learned about in John, and the life was the light of the world, that it comes from God. In Greek, there's a word pneuma, and pneuma means spirit, breath, and wind. So in some cases, he talks about breath and wind using
like
and that is like mere breath. This has to do with something greater than that, something that's infused with, this life that comes from God. He acknowledges it. He's aware of it intellectually, but he's lost the way to live with it.
And that's it.
That's it for today.
Yeah.
All right. Where are we leaving off? It is exactly 10. That never happens. So we're leaving at verse 13. I want to be king. Yeah. Tom Petty has a song, "The World Would Swing If I Were King." Yeah, people, we tend to think that when I get to be king, there are going to be some changes around here. That's the way we are. So don't lose sight of the fact that this is what God instructed through the prophets when he told them, you really don't want a king. I'm telling you guys, I don't want you to have a king. You don't want a king. This is what happens. And Solomon is the cheery, pleasant version of it. We see in most of the other kings, nearly every one of them, not everyone, but as we go through the book of Kings, we see the chapter about them, or the chapters, and then the last sentence is, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, over and over again. And so while Solomon, was not, he's a good king. This is still what happens. This is why. So if you're looking for, as Mary worried this morning, just before we started, what do we do with this? Well, we can learn from the negative example, right? We can look at this and see bits and pieces of ourselves. And we may not be the wealthiest person to ever live in Jerusalem, but we fall into a lot of the same traps. God, we're thankful for words that you leave behind, the inspired words that speak to us, sometimes in ways that we readily understand and enjoy hearing, and other times in ways that are more difficult to understand or that we don't want to hear. You rebuke us at times with these words. You show us our own folly. You show us that we have a need to include you in our plans, and you can see the results of not doing that through these words that you leave behind. Grant us wisdom. Grant us the desire to look for you, and rather than just trusting our own wisdom, understand that true wisdom comes from you, and that's why we pursue it. Be with us this week. Be with those we pray for. Help the understanding of why circumstances are not always the way we want it, but at the same time to know that it's good and that you're good and you do have us in your hand. Always try and remind us, God, always look for those ways and open our hearts to see around us this world in need, and that we have a place in it. We have the ability to do, even if it's small things, that we have a part in the plan. Amen.
Amen. You guys can unmute yourselves. Thank you guys for joining us today.
It's good to see you. I really appreciate, and there we go. Gina, it's good to see you today. I didn't speak to you, but it's good to see you.
And Naya's in Virginia.
I know that, Naya, as soon as I saw you, my first thought is, I mean, because things were a little unsettled in Portugal, and I know you liked it there. So you're doing okay in Virginia?
Yeah, doing okay. It's really pretty here. It's really pretty, and it's not as much of a culture shock as I thought yet. We'll see in 6 months. But yeah.
We had friends when we were in Israel that were with the government, State Department, all these, oh, she's gone. Oh,
I'm
there you
here.
are. You moved a square on me. It's like,
Okay.
and anyway, it was, the transition was difficult. So you've been on my mind. I'm glad to hear it's going well.
Oh yeah, it's going fine. It's the new area for us, so we get to travel and explore, and we love that. So yeah.
And we look forward to seeing you in Rockport soon.
And
Yeah,
Karen,
thanks Mary for everything. Thank you.
I heard
Thanks, you
your
guys.
voice from the other room this morning, Karen, and I thought, is that Karen Ernst? It was good to hear you.
You guys have a good day.
The wire on that.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
There you go. Yeah.